I knew something was off the moment I walked into their apartment that Saturday morning. The sunlight was sharp, cutting across the living room floor in bright rectangles, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. My son Amir greeted me with that same wide smile he always had, the one that made me think he was genuinely happy, but there was a tension in the room I couldn't quite place. His wife, Leela, stood by the kitchen counter, humming softly while arranging cups for tea. She looked perfect as always, calm, graceful, smiling, the kind of person who could melt anyone's heart with just a glance. Everyone called her an angel, and I'd been one of those people. I had trusted her. I had celebrated her, but that morning, something in her eyes didn't match the rest of her face. I couldn't explain it at first, maybe a flicker too quick to catch, like a shadow darting across her otherwise radiant expression. And yet, in that instant, something deep inside me tensed. Mothers have instincts, I've learned over decades, and mine was screaming that all was not as it seemed. Amir didn't notice anything. He poured me a cup of tea, careful not to spill a drop, and we sat down at the small table in the corner. Leela came over and smiled at me, all sweetness and warmth. "I made your favorite," she said, placing a plate of biscuits in front of me. I nodded politely, forcing a smile. But my mind was elsewhere, churning over the subtle cues I couldn't yet name. The way her hand lingered on the teapot longer than necessary. The way she tilted her head almost calculatingly when Amir spoke. Something about the way she moved, so precise, so controlled, it wasn't natural. It was deliberate. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was overthinking. She had always been kind to me, in public at least, and Amir adored her. Maybe I was imagining shadows where none existed. But then, as she moved back toward the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of her expression in the reflection of the window. Her smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, replaced by something colder, sharper, an expression that didn't belong to the sweet, angelic woman everyone else believed her to be. I told myself it was nothing. Surely it was nothing. I tried to focus on the conversation with Amir, trying to keep things light. We talked about work, the car that needed fixing, the small victories of his week. But even as he spoke, I felt a growing unease in my chest, a pressure that didn't let up. Something inside me was unsettled, a warning I couldn't ignore. Later, when Amir stepped out to take a call, I followed her into the kitchen under the guise of offering help with the dishes. That's when I saw a folder, partially hidden under the counter, the corner of it peeking out in a way that screamed for attention. My curiosity got the better of me. I pulled it out and froze. Inside were documents, photographs, and handwritten notes, things that didn't belong in the life of the woman I thought I knew. Bills in other people's names, letters from unknown contacts, and a series of messages that hinted at manipulation, deceit, even control. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. Each document chipped away at the image of Leela I had cherished in my mind. The sweet, perfect angel was someone else entirely. Someone who had been hiding behind a mask all this time. I felt the floor shift beneath me, the room tilting in a way that made it hard to breathe. The tea had gone cold on the table, and the light from the window suddenly felt harsh, exposing every corner of the room with unforgiving clarity. How could I have missed this? How could I have celebrated her, welcomed her into our family, trusted her so completely? And then I remembered Amir laughing at breakfast last week, how he had spoken of her with that same unguarded joy I had once felt for him. He had no idea what I had found, no idea of the cracks beneath the surface of his perfect marriage. My heart ached at the thought of him being so blind, so vulnerable. I wanted to warn him, to shout, to pull him back from the edge, but a part of me feared what he would think of me, feared that he would blame me for doubting her, for seeing what he couldn't. I put the folder down gently, almost as if touching it might somehow undo the discovery. I needed time, clarity, a plan, but the seed of truth had been planted, and it would not be ignored. I sat there, staring at the kitchen wall, the weight of realization pressing down like a stone in my chest. Amir would return soon. He would come in smiling, oblivious, and I would have to face him with this knowledge or wait, and watch as the illusion of their happiness continued to unravel on its own. In that moment, I felt a storm rise inside me, a mixture of fear, anger, sorrow, and a strange, protective determination. I knew my life had changed in that instant, irrevocably. My son's life had changed, and the woman I had loved as a daughter, as someone worthy of trust, had revealed a face I was never prepared to see. I stood up, my hands shaking slightly, and placed the folder back where I had found it, careful not to disturb anything else. But I kept my eyes on her, following her movements as she hummed and poured tea, perfectly poised, perfectly calm, pretending nothing was wrong. And that's when I realized something chilling. She knew I had seen something. I couldn't tell if it was fear or amusement in her eyes, but there was a flicker of recognition. A subtle shift that said she understood the power of what she held over me, over my family. Over Amir.it was the first time I truly feared her, not the surface level fear of disagreement or irritation, but the deeper, bone deep fear that comes when someone you trust is capable of a cold, calculated deception. And in that fear, I felt a new kind of clarity. I had to uncover everything, not just for myself, but for Amir, for my family. I had to see who she really was, before it was too late, and so I waited, silent, careful, watching her move through the apartment with that serene, angelic grace. I waited for the next slip, the next sign, the next proof that would confirm the darkness I had glimpsed. I knew that once I uncovered it fully, nothing would ever be the same. Not for me, not for my son, and certainly not for her. That morning, I discovered the first piece of truth. The rest of it would unravel slowly, painfully, like pulling thread through a wound. And in that unraveling, I knew we would all be changed forever. I remember the first time I truly began to see Amir as more than just my son, as someone with his own life, his own choices, his own vulnerabilities. He had always been a quiet boy, thoughtful, sensitive, the kind of child who notices the smallest details and internalizes them. I'd watched him grow, watched him wrestle with school pressures, friendships, and later work challenges. He was never reckless, never careless, but he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders in a way I think only mothers can notice. And in that weight, I saw how easily he could be misled, how much he needed people he could trust, and that was why seeing Leela's other side hurt so much. Before I knew the real her, our visits had been filled with laughter and warmth. We would sit in the living room, drink tea, and talk about his day. Amir loved to talk about the small things, the way his team was doing at work, a funny encounter on the street, a neighbor's new puppy. Leela would always smile in agreement, nodding gently, letting him speak, sometimes interjecting with a carefully placed joke or an encouraging word. On the surface, she was supportive, engaged, loving, the ideal partner any parent would hope for their child. At home, my own routine was simple, but not without struggle. I had worked tirelessly my whole life, raising my children with the belief that honesty, patience, and compassion were the things that mattered most. My husband had passed years ago, leaving me to manage everything on my own, and I learned early how exhausting the balance could be between work, bills, household tasks, and emotional labor. But despite it all, I took pride in raising Amir to be someone thoughtful, kind, and responsible. And seeing him in love, seeing him happy, should have been a reward. A light at the end of long years of sacrifice. I would wake early, make his favorite breakfast when he visited, and linger over conversations that felt intimate, like little windows into his life that only I was allowed to see. Leela would always be present in these moments, smiling politely, her voice soft, her gestures careful. There were small signs, of course tiny inconsistencies that I had shrugged off. The way she would mention things Amir had never spoken of, as if she had done some research on him. The way she always had an answer ready, perfectly timed, like a rehearsed line. I thought these were just quirks, just the ways of someone trying to be loved and accepted. I was wrong. Amir's life with her had seemed smooth, too smooth in some ways. Their apartment was spotless, organized, almost sterile. Friends and family would compliment her on how perfect she was, and I'd smile along, feeling a mixture of pride and relief. I had feared for him, feared he might choose the wrong person, but she seemed so ideal, so angelic. And yet, beneath that, there was a rigidity, a precision, a meticulousness that went beyond normal tidiness. It didn't feel warm. It felt calculated. But I told myself I was imagining things. Mothers worry, mothers doubt, mothers overthink. That's what I kept telling myself. In those early months after their wedding, I began to notice subtle changes in Amir. He was still cheerful, still loving, but he seemed more cautious, more hesitant in his own home. He started double-checking things, locking doors, securing windows, even small acts that seemed out of character for him. I noticed it, but I kept my observations to myself, thinking maybe it was just him adjusting to married life, to shared responsibilities, to new routines. After all, marriage changes everything, and I didn't want to intrude. Our dinners together became less frequent. When they did happen, I would see a subtle tension in Amir's voice when he spoke to her, a pause here, a careful word there, like he was negotiating some invisible boundary. And Leela? She never raised her voice, never lost composure. Her smile remained, her tone soft, her gestures gentle, but the silence between them spoke louder than any argument ever could. I didn't understand it fully at the time, but there was a dynamic at play that was invisible to outsiders. Something that slowly began to build, a pressure I couldn't ignore. I also began reflecting on my own sacrifices over the years, the long nights working multiple jobs, the moments I missed with Amir because I had to provide, the times I held back my own emotions to keep the household afloat. I had hoped, in some quiet corner of my heart, that he would find someone who appreciated all that, someone who would love him for who he was, flaws and all, and help him navigate the world instead of complicating it. I wanted him to feel safe, to feel seen, to feel genuinely loved without conditions. That desire made the creeping unease I felt around Leela all the more painful. Daily life in those months after discovering the first hint of her duplicity was like walking on a knife's edge. I kept my distance, observing quietly, trying to understand what I was seeing without alerting Amir or her. Every interaction was loaded with hidden meaning. I would watch them from the doorway or across the room, noting the way she spoke, how he responded, the subtle inflections in their voices. Every laugh, every touch, every casual word seemed to carry more weight, more intention than I had realized before. There were moments, too, when Amir would confide in me without realizing the danger of his openness. He would talk about how he sometimes felt a little invisible in his own home, how he worried about upsetting her, or how he couldn't tell her certain things without expecting criticism or judgment. My heart would ache hearing him speak this way. The son I had raised with confidence and empathy was shrinking, carefully navigating a minefield, all under the guise of a happy marriage, and yet, he still loved her. That part never changed. He believed in her, believed in the version of her she presented. He was blind to her other face, the one I had glimpsed, and I felt the weight of that blindness like a physical burden. How could someone so bright, so kind, so aware in so many areas, be so completely unaware of the person he had married? The question haunted me daily. I spent hours piecing together her actions, replaying moments in my mind, comparing them against the documents I had found. I thought about her interactions with neighbors, with colleagues, with friends, how she always maintained the perfect image, how she deflected scrutiny, how she could manipulate situations without anyone realizing it. She was not cruel in a cartoonish way, not loudly malicious, but in subtle, almost invisible ways that undermined Amir's sense of self. That reshaped reality around her control. Life, in those months, became a careful balance of observation and support. I tried to offer Amir comfort in small, indirect ways, asking gentle questions, leaving him little notes, finding moments where he could feel seen and heard without Leela's presence. And slowly, I began to notice cracks in her armor, small slips that hinted at the truth beneath the polished exterior. A glance too sharp, a phrase too pointed, a hesitation in her voice that didn't align with the angelic persona she wore so flawlessly. Through it all, I carried a heavy burden, the knowledge of what I had seen, and the fear of how it would affect Amir. My own days were consumed with worry, sleepless nights imagining scenarios I didn't want to confront, and the constant calculation of how to protect my son while gathering the evidence I knew we would eventually need. My life had become a quiet, hidden battlefield, one where love, fear, and determination collided every single day. And yet, even in that chaos, I held on to hope, the hope that Amir could one day see the truth, that he could reclaim his happiness, that he could be free of the subtle, suffocating control that had already begun to shape his life. That hope was the only thing that kept me going, the only anchor in the storm that Leela had brought into our lives without anyone realizing it. I began to realize, in those long days and quiet nights, that life had a way of teaching you lessons not through grand gestures, but through small, persistent truths that accumulate over time. Every interaction, every observation, every silent moment became a piece of a puzzle I had to solve, not for myself, but for the son I loved more than anything in the world. And in this slow, painstaking way, I started to understand the full picture of our lives now. a family held together by love, yet threatened by deception, a son trapped between reality and illusion, and a woman who had perfected the art of hiding her true self. Each day, I felt the tension grow, the stakes rise, and the inevitability of a confrontation looming in the distance. I had learned by then that the quiet, everyday moments often reveal more truth than the loud, dramatic ones. And as I watched Amir navigate his daily life, still unaware of the full reality, I knew that our story, his story, my story, was only beginning to take shape in ways none of us could yet fully grasp. The tension didn't explode suddenly. It crept in, almost imperceptibly at first, like water slowly rising in a room, until it reaches your chest and you realize you can't breathe without struggle. I began noticing small shifts in Amir's behavior: hesitations, uncharacteristic silences, the subtle way he would check his phone or glance toward the bedroom as if expecting something. It was clear that he was walking on eggshells, though outwardly he maintained that same calm, warm smile he always had. I could see it behind his eyes, the quiet worry that he couldn't voice, the fear that speaking up might trigger some invisible reprimand. Leela, on the other hand, moved through the apartment like a conductor of a symphony, orchestrating every word, every action, every look. Nothing was accidental. Her soft laughter masked precise calculations, and the sweetness of her voice carried subtle commands that Amir seemed compelled to obey without realizing it. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't yell, she didn't even scold. Yet her presence was controlling, a quiet gravitational pull that reshaped the world around her. I began to recognize her techniques: the way she would ask questions that seemed casual but were designed to provoke guilt, the way she offered help only to make Amir feel indebted, the way she could invalidate concerns with a gentle smile, leaving him second-guessing his own judgment. I started keeping track in my mind of these patterns. Days bled into nights as I analyzed conversations, observed interactions, and tried to predict the effects of her words before they landed. Amir would speak of minor incidents, brushing them off as trivial, but I could see the accumulation, the little eroding of confidence, the subtle reshaping of his self-esteem. I realized painfully that manipulation doesn't always wear the face of cruelty. Often, it is gentle, almost invisible, until the person affected no longer recognizes their own boundaries. One evening, I found myself standing by the doorway as she spoke to Amir about finances. Her voice was calm, her instructions seemingly helpful. "Maybe we should reconsider this investment, Amir. I think it's safer if we wait." But it wasn't advice. It was control. She framed the conversation as collaboration, but every sentence subtly undermined him, making him doubt his own judgment, while presenting herself as the rational, guiding voice. Amir didn't notice the subtle erosion, but I did. And the realization made my stomach churn. There were moments when she would leave the room for just a minute, and I could see the tension in Amir's posture immediately. His shoulders would slump, his smile would falter, and a quiet sigh would escape him, as if the invisible pressure had been momentarily lifted. These were the moments I clung to, the glimpses of the man I had raised, unencumbered by someone else's careful manipulation. It was heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. I began to reflect on my own life during these months, on the years of sacrifices, of teaching Amir to stand tall, to trust his instincts, to value honesty. I had worked to raise him into someone who could face the world bravely, yet now I watched him shrink under the subtle control of someone I had once called family. It was a cruel irony that the lessons I had instilled in him seemed to vanish in the presence of this perfectly composed, unassuming woman. The manipulation wasn't limited to daily interactions. She had started infiltrating our social circles, shaping perceptions. Friends and relatives who once knew Amir's independent spirit began commenting on how considerate he had become, how patient, how understanding of his wife's needs. They didn't see the quiet cost of these changes. They didn't see the hesitation in his laughter, the slight anxiety that lingered in his eyes. I tried, in subtle ways, to signal my concern, but it was difficult without drawing attention. Speaking directly might push Amir away, and he had already begun defending her in ways that made my heart ache. And there was the silence that followed, moments of subtle control, the silence that weighed heavier than any argument. It was the most insidious weapon, because it didn't demand confrontation, it demanded compliance. Amir learned gradually to navigate it, to predict her moods, to adjust his own behavior. He became cautious, calculated in ways he never had to be before. The spark of unguarded spontaneity I had cherished was dimming, replaced by careful, measured responses. I also noticed the emotional toll it took on him at night. After she had gone to bed, he would sometimes pace the apartment, staring out the window as if searching for answers in the city lights. I could hear the quiet edge in his voice when he called me late at night, seeking reassurance, seeking grounding. He didn't speak of her directly, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. He was beginning to understand, in a murky, confused way, that not everything was as it seemed, but he didn't yet have the clarity I had glimpsed when I found that folder, and through it all, I remained vigilant. Every interaction became a subtle investigation, every conversation a test of her carefully constructed persona. I watched for patterns, for inconsistencies, for moments when her composure faltered even briefly. Sometimes it was just a flicker in her eyes, a hesitation in her tone, a hand that lingered too long on the counter. Small things that seemed meaningless to anyone else were crucial pieces of a puzzle I was piecing together. I began documenting it all in a quiet notebook, hidden away from sight. Every word, every gesture, every pattern of behavior was recorded. It became a map of her influence over Amir, a guide to understanding the ways she had reshaped his world. I knew that one day, this record would be necessary not for revenge, not for confrontation, but for truth. Because truth was the only weapon we had against someone who had learned to control reality itself. As the months passed, I also noticed her reactions to me changing. She began testing boundaries, subtly probing my own confidence, attempting to gauge how much I suspected, how much I knew. She would comment casually on Amir's habits in ways that felt pointed, almost like a warning. "I hope Amir isn't sharing too much with you about us." Or she would smile at me, her eyes cold just for a heartbeat, and say, "You've always been such a careful mother." It was almost playful, but the undertone was unmistakable. She was aware, and she was assessing me as a potential threat. At times, I questioned my own perception. Was I imagining these patterns? Was I projecting fears onto ordinary behavior? But no. The subtlety of her manipulation, the way Amir's personality shifted, the small cracks that appeared in her perfect mask, it all confirmed what I had begun to sense the day I first saw the hidden documents. This was no accident. This was a carefully orchestrated control, executed with precision, patience, and a chilling calm. And yet, even in this growing tension, I saw glimpses of hope. Amir still sought connection, still trusted me enough to speak indirectly, still allowed moments of vulnerability. And that was my lifeline. That was the part of him I could protect, nurture, and guide toward the truth. I held onto those glimpses like precious fragments, evidence that the real Amir, strong, thoughtful, unmanipulated, still existed beneath the layers she had imposed. I also learned the painful truth that manipulation is not always dramatic or explosive. It is quiet, insidious, almost invisible to outsiders. It can infiltrate a marriage, a household, a life, without raising alarms. And once it takes hold, it shifts the balance of power slowly but inexorably until the affected person no longer recognizes their own world. I saw it happening to Amir, and I realized that uncovering the truth would require more than intuition. It would require strategy, patience, and an unflinching commitment to reveal what had been hidden. The days became a careful choreography of observation, protection, and subtle intervention. I would ask innocuous questions to gauge reactions, gently redirect conversations to prevent unnecessary stress for Amir, and meticulously note every slip, every tell, every quiet control tactic. Life had turned into a delicate dance of survival, not for myself, but for the son I loved, and for the truth that had been buried beneath layers of sweetness and charm. Every evening, as I returned home, I would think about what the next day would bring. Each encounter, each conversation, each small interaction was a test of her control, of Amir's awareness, of my ability to protect him without revealing too much. And slowly, with each passing week, the subtle pressure of her manipulation began to weigh more heavily, revealing the true extent of the quiet storm she had brought into our lives. It was exhausting, painful, and heartbreaking, but it was also necessary. Because the longer we waited, the deeper her control could become. The longer Amir remained unaware, the more his own sense of self could be eroded. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I could not let that happen. Not to him, not to our family. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, in a way I had both feared and hoped for. I had been observing for months, keeping track of her subtle manipulations, waiting for a moment when her carefully constructed world would crack even slightly. And that morning, it happened. She had left her laptop open on the dining table, just long enough for me to notice the screen. It wasn't meant for me, of course, but sometimes, in the carelessness of overconfidence, people reveal everything without realizing it. I approached slowly, heart pounding. The screen displayed a series of emails, some formal, some casual, but all of them unmistakable. Once I began reading, they weren't addressed to Amir, and they weren't meant for family members. They were correspondence with people who clearly knew her private manipulations, her ability to control situations, her talent for creating illusions. There were messages about Amir himself, about ways to influence him, about strategies to maintain the perfect image while subtly undermining his independence. Each word I read sent a cold shiver down my spine. This was the evidence I had been waiting for. The proof that the woman everyone called an angel had a side no one had seen, and she had been methodically controlling my son's life all along. I didn't shout, didn't move too quickly, though my hands shook. I copied everything carefully, making sure to preserve timestamps and attachments, every shred of documentation that would leave no room for doubt. My mind raced, thinking of Amir, of the man he had been before this subtle suffocation began, and of the steps I needed to take to bring the truth to light without crushing him in the process. The storm of fear, anger, and sorrow I had carried for months now surged into focused determination. I had the proof, and with proof comes power, the power to reclaim truth from someone who had rewritten reality for my son. Later that afternoon, Amir returned home, smiling as usual, completely unaware of the storm that had just quietly shifted in his favor. I waited, observing, letting him speak, letting him share minor frustrations and joys alike, all while knowing what I had discovered. I could feel the tension in my chest, the tight coil of readiness that only comes when you know the exact moment to act, and then came the confrontation. Not loud, not explosive, but deliberate, calculated, and inevitable. I called Amir into the study, the quiet room where he often went to unwind, and I placed the laptop and the copies of the emails before him. His eyes widened in shock, disbelief washing over his face. He read the first few lines, then looked up at me, his expression a mixture of confusion, hurt, and dawning realization. She's been controlling everything? He whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded. Not everything, but enough. Enough to affect how you live, how you feel, how you see yourself. You deserve to know the truth. The tears came then, not for the betrayal itself, but for the years of subtle erosion, for the moments lost, for the quiet manipulation that had invaded the life of the person I loved most. Amir sank into the chair, burying his face in his hands, and I sat beside him, offering silent support. He didn't speak for a long time, letting the weight of revelation settle in, letting the realization of what he had trusted and loved clash violently with the evidence before him. When he finally looked up, his eyes were clear, hard, resolute. I need to see her. I need to confront her, he said. His voice trembled, but there was fire there now, a determination that hadn't existed before. I guided him through it. Together, we formulated a plan not to humiliate her, not to destroy her, but to demand honesty and accountability. When she returned that evening, everything changed. The air in the apartment shifted, charged with a tension that even her composure could not mask. She saw the laptop, saw the documents, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. Her angelic facade faltered, replaced by something colder, sharper, defensive. Amir confronted her calmly but firmly, reading out pieces of evidence, asking questions she could not evade. The power balance, which had been so carefully in her favor for months, flipped in an instant. She tried to maintain control, tried to deflect, tried to charm, but the truth was undeniable, the documentation irrefutable. Every tactic she had used, every subtle manipulation, every carefully orchestrated moment of control was laid bare. I watched as Amir, who had been quietly eroding under her influence, began reclaiming himself in real time. His posture straightened, his voice gained strength, and for the first time in months, I saw the man I had raised, confident and clear-eyed, emerge from beneath the weight of her deception. It was both painful and profoundly relieving to witness. She faltered, then attempted silence, the same weapon she had used against him for months, thinking it would bend him again. But Amir had seen the truth. He would no longer be swayed by gentle coercion or careful smiles. His eyes met mine, silently acknowledging the support I had offered throughout this ordeal, and I felt a surge of pride and sorrow all at once. Pride that he had found his strength, sorrow for all the moments stolen by her manipulation. Over the next hours, more truths surfaced. She admitted to actions, schemes, and deceptions we had only suspected. Amir asked questions, and I guided him when he faltered, giving him space to absorb, to confront, to understand. It wasn't easy, it wasn't clean, but it was real. And reality, no matter how painful, is the foundation on which healing and justice are built. By the end of that evening, the shift was complete. The carefully maintained illusion had crumbled. Leela's power over Amir, subtle and insidious as it had been stripped away. She realized she could no longer manipulate, could no longer hide, could no longer shape his life without consequence. The truth had been revealed, and with it came a quiet, undeniable power. For Amir and for me. It wasn't dramatic, not in the way movies depict confrontations. There were no shouting matches, no physical confrontations, no theatrical displays of anger. It was a calm, deliberate exposure of truth, the kind of quiet reckoning that leaves no room for denial. And as Amir looked at her, no longer fearful, no longer unsure, I knew that this was the moment when life would begin to settle, when the hidden fractures could finally start to heal. Later, after the confrontation, Amir and I sat together, exhausted but relieved. We talked in hushed tones about the months we had endured, about the subtle manipulations and emotional erosion, and about what steps would come next. He didn't hate her, not completely, not the person she had pretended to be, but he understood the danger of the other side of her. And he vowed never to let anyone reshape his life so quietly, so insidiously, ever again. In that moment, I realized that the months of quiet observation, the careful documentation, the endless worry and vigilance had not been in vain. The truth had been uncovered, and with it came not vengeance, but empowerment. Amir was free to rebuild, to reclaim himself, and to step into a life that belonged to him, unmanipulated, unshadowed, and fully seen. After that confrontation, the apartment felt different. Not louder, not chaotic, but lighter, as if a weight that had been pressing down for months had finally been lifted. Amir moved through the rooms with a calm I hadn't seen in a long time, unhurried, unguarded. He wasn't carrying the invisible burdens that had been imposed upon him. The tension that had twisted every interaction, every word, every glance was gone. We spent the days that followed in quiet reflection. There was no dramatic celebration, no grand statements or declarations. Amir needed space, time to process, time to understand the person he had married and the truth behind her facade. I gave him that space, quietly present, listening when he wanted to speak, silent when he needed solitude. And slowly, day by day, he began to reclaim his world. He started small at first, making decisions for himself without hesitation, voicing opinions without the careful weighing of her imagined reactions, laughing without reservation. I watched him with a mixture of relief and pride, understanding that the small victories were what truly mattered. This was not about punishment or revenge. It was about restoring dignity, restoring autonomy, restoring life that had been quietly reshaped without consent. Leela's presence in our lives became limited and formal. She no longer had the same influence, the same subtle power she had wielded for months. The quiet control she had exerted was gone, replaced by the understanding that truth had been exposed, and with exposure comes boundaries. Amir had learned painfully that people can wear masks and charm can be deceptive, but honesty, once demanded, cannot be denied. We also began the process of mending the small fractures in our family life. Amir and I spent long hours talking not about anger or blame, but about understanding, reflection, and healing. I encouraged him to recognize the subtle ways he had been manipulated, to validate his own feelings of confusion, hurt, and betrayal. He needed to trust himself again, and for the first time in months, I could see that trust rekindling in his eyes. It was in these quiet moments that I realized something profound. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes justice is soft, patient, quiet. It is the slow reclamation of a life, the subtle empowerment of someone who had been overshadowed. It is dignity restored, not loudly celebrated, but firmly, undeniably reclaimed. Amir didn't need to lash out. He didn't need dramatic confrontations. He only needed the truth and the space to rebuild himself on the foundation of that truth, and rebuild he did. He took control of his life with care and thoughtfulness, learning from the experience without allowing it to embitter him. He set boundaries, cultivated independence, and nurtured relationships with people who valued honesty and mutual respect. The shadow that had once clouded his confidence and happiness faded, replaced by clarity, resilience, and quiet strength. For me, the resolution brought a profound sense of relief, mixed with reflection. I thought about the months of tension, the sleepless nights, the careful observations, the silent worry. I thought about the small ways in which manipulation can erode life quietly, invisibly, and how vigilance, patience, and love can counter it. I realized that my role had never been to fight for him directly, but to watch, to support, to be present, and to offer the truth when the time was right. That patience, that steady presence, had allowed Amir to reclaim himself fully, on his own terms, with dignity intact. We never sought revenge. There was no triumphalism, no celebration of another's failure. Instead, there was quiet justice, the kind that resonates deeply because it is earned, because it is grounded in truth, because it restores what was lost without shattering what remains. Amir had been wronged, yes, but he had also grown stronger, wiser, more resilient. And for me, as his mother, witnessing that growth was both relief and reward in itself. The apartment, once tense and heavy, felt warm again. Light filled the corners. Laughter returned to our conversations, and Amir moved through life with a calm confidence that radiated naturally, without the careful calculations he had learned to employ in her presence. It was not perfection, but it was authenticity, the quiet, powerful kind that sustains life and nurtures the soul. I often think back to that morning when I first discovered her hidden folder. When the first seeds of doubt and fear were planted, I remember the shock, the fear, the anger, and the sorrow. And I also remember the decision I made to act with patience, with observation, with steadfast care. That choice, more than any confrontation or revelation, shaped the outcome. It allowed truth to emerge in its full force, allowed Amir to reclaim his life without destruction, and allowed our family to heal slowly, authentically, without losing the essence of what mattered most: love, trust, and dignity. In the end, we didn't need dramatic gestures or loud vindication. What mattered was quiet strength, quiet justice, and the reclamation of life and self. Amir walked forward with clarity, unburdened by manipulation, and I walked beside him not as a rescuer, but as a witness, a supporter, a mother who had trusted her instincts and waited for truth to emerge. And in that stillness, in that calm reclamation of life, we found a peace that was deeper than any dramatics, a justice that was earned not through noise, but through patience, courage, and unwavering love. Months later, as I watch him navigate the world with renewed confidence, I understand fully what had happened. The woman we had once trusted had worn a mask, but truth, once uncovered, cannot be hidden. Amir has reclaimed his life, his decisions, his happiness, and that, in the quietest, most profound way, is justice.